we are once again. Talk number 4. Welcome back. If you've been listening, welcome. If you have not been listening, and let's get to it. Talk number 4. Yes, number 4, chapter 4. I hate using that word chapter. I've let it slip a couple times. Used the word chapter. That this was originally a manuscript. Let's just call it talk. Talk number 4. The romantic rejection of blissful ignorance through the Grateful Dead standing on the moon. All right, long anecdote to begin this one, people. So moving to a small college town in rural Louisiana in the fall of 2011, it was a big change for me. I mean, for the most part, down here in this context, I'm all Yankee. I was, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. It's one of the largest cities in the Midwest right now, which tends to surprise people. I did my undergrad at Boston University. I studied abroad for a term in the UK at Oxford. I lived in New York City for 10 years, where I did my PhD and lived afterwards as a postdoctoral fellow. Living in the Bronx on Arthur Avenue in the Little Italy of the Bronx, which was freaking awesome. And I've done a lot of traveling throughout my time. I've been all over the States, all over Europe, as well as, a couple weeks in Israel, a strange 4-day trip to Australia. Long story. Alas, I do consider myself to be a fairly experienced, well-educated, slightly sophisticated dude. And then just like that, the tenure track job finally came my way in 2011. And when you get a PhD in the liberal arts, you really do not have much of a choice of where you end up, unless you're coming from, I guess you would say, an Ivy League school or somewhere comparable, or you're some kind of scholastic rock star, which I am not. You're just lucky enough to get a job, and you go where the job takes you. Hence, in 2011, I was off to the Bible Belt, to a town of about 25,000 people, where the culture is, I guess you would say, a different understanding of the very notion of culture. Down here, the only thing more ubiquitous than fast food chains are churches. The move to Louisiana was something else. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking shit about my school or my town. Well, at least not totally. I love my colleagues, most of them, and my students, a good majority of them. And I've adapted accordingly. Let's just say that there are certain aspects of the South that rub me the wrong way. And we'll leave out the specifics. But if you know how Rust Cole feels about Louisiana, then you pretty much know how I feel about Louisiana. Pop culture reference. That is to season 1 of True Detective, HBO Max 2014. Matthew McConaughey's character. I relate to that guy sometimes. On a side note, also, those most people when they think of Louisiana, they think New Orleans. And there is New Orleans. Understand that there's New Orleans and then there's Louisiana. Two very different notions of culture. Also, by the way, if you've been listening to this and continue to listen to this, you'll probably get the gist of what I'm referring to without me having to lay it out there for you in terms of me being where I am. With all that said, whenever I get a chance to get out of town, I'm gone. Whether it's weekend trips to Nashville or visit my buddy in Austin, golfing adventures anywhere, my yearly ski trips with my brother and his wife and my niece and my nephews, my fall football trips that I make every year with 3 of my very good friends to a different college football destination, though at this point we pretty much just have SEC schools on rotation. Anytime I can make it back to New York, I do so. I also hate summer down here. I've never really been a fan of summer at all, but Louisiana heat is utterly unbearable. So much so that the past few summers, I've pretty much just packed up my dogs and gone home to Ohio to live in my mother's spare bedroom for 6 to 8 weeks. A middle-aged man, past middle age, consciously choosing to live with his mother who's in her 70s for a couple of months. That's how much I hate summer down south. Don't read that as a slight towards my mother. She's freaking awesome. Side note: last summer, I really, took it up a notch and just grabbed, 10 of my English students, my English majors, and yeah, we just jumped across the pond and went to the UK for half the summer. That was awesome. I need to do that every summer. However, since I've been down here, I've always looked for some sort of summer respite. And in 2015, I certainly found what I was looking for. Now, I remember the summer of 2015 all too well, at least parts of it. Some of it faded away due to certain choices that were made. Yeah, well, let me get to the point. One of my best friends, Heather, from college in Boston, lived and still does in Durango, Colorado. Now, I remember being on the phone with Heather in the spring of 2015, complaining about how much I wanted to get out of Louisiana for the summer, and she came up with a great idea. Forgot to mention, Heather is one of my hippie friends. I have a few hippie friends. Okay, say what you want, people, but hippies still exist. However, some of them just happen to make 6 or 7 figures, but that doesn't attract from them still being hippies. Trust me, I know this all too well. But anyway, Heather said to me, that I, along with my dog, I only had one at the time, not the two that you see every once in a while roaming around in the background. But she said that we could come to Durango for 10 weeks and live in her camper. And she'd put me to work mainly because she and her husband at the time were going to be doing a lot of traveling that summer. And they needed someone to look after their house and their garden. It's Colorado, so you probably get the drift. It's legal there, so you can't blame me for doing anything wrong. All right. Again, the only people who own, $1 million houses in the mountains, and still have campers, they're hippies. Yeah. Looking after her garden, I rarely have plants of any kind in my house. There's one over my shoulder somewhere over there, and it's dead, and it's been dead for a while. I just keep it up there for shits and giggles. That summer I would learn a lot about botany. I was paid handsomely as well, a hell of a lot better than teaching a summer course. And now this was the summer of 2015. So the question is, why would a couple of hippies be going out of town so often? Remember, they're hippies. Yes, this was the summer when the remaining members of the Grateful Dead would be doing a series of shows in California and Chicago to mark their 50th anniversary. My hippie friends, they'd be going to all of them. So let's get one thing straight. I'm the furthest thing from a deadhead you could ever find. I do not and never have really liked the Grateful Dead. Remember my two buddies from high school who sold back their Nirvana CDs? Yeah, well, they were tremendous deadheads. For them, growing up, going to Dead shows while we were in high school, it was almost a religious experience for those dudes. Shows at Buckeye Lake just outside of Columbus, Riverbend in Cincinnati, Blossom in Cleveland, Deer Creek in Indiana. No matter where the Dead played regionally, my buddies were there. And they would dress the part. Tie-dye, steal your face paraphernalia, no showering while camping out, stinking of patchouli, and then the obvious, the drugs. It was always about the drugs. The trippy aspect of Dead shows, really being the driving force behind the band's ethos. Listen, I respect the band's longevity, and obviously I find them significant enough to, have a nice long conversation with you about them. And their lyrics. But I always despise, the kind of hippy dippy aspect of conjoining their art with drugs. Similar to the image, all of it just seemed, so forced. And the stories that I'd hear about, LSD trips, psilocybin mushrooms, nitrous tanks in the parking lot of shows, and obviously all the weed. The image and the drugs, it really, for me, at least, it seemed to usurp the music itself. Similar to how, the performative aspect of certain musicians, what I just talked about in my previous discussion and my previous talk, sometimes usurps art. It always seemed to me to be more of a distraction. I know. All of you hippies out there, I apparently just don't get it. Yes, the counter argument stemming from the deadheads would be that the drugs and the rest of the culture really enhances the entire experience. Now, I'm going to give you two examples of this argument, both of which came from my time in Durango in 2015. Now, here's the first. Now, this is a text message that my friend Heather showed me from one of her friends, right after the shows in Chicago. So the text message sent July 5th, 2015, from somewhere in downtown Chicago. Wish we could have spent more time at the show, but the L made it impossible to use any kind of technology. The pixels everywhere were simply breathing back into my brain from the screen, and I couldn't look at my phone since it started to talk to me with a fairly menacing demeanor. Girlfriend's phone was also bad. I could hear it breathing. Steve Jobs clearly had something to do with this. All that acid, man. Sunday night was worse because I was in the womb all night and just couldn't escape. Light rays were terrifying and words no longer meant anything to me. The set break was an inescapable horror, especially since I'm fairly certain Bobby died the night before while backstage, and everything else that looked like him was merely a hallucination and not his true form, which has been manifested to some better place. Then I got in a fight with a helicopter in the parking lot after the show and became stranded at some Safeway parking lot because of roadblocks and what appeared to be rioting, though I could be mistaken. Waited till 4 a.m. before I could see well enough to walk back to my car and drive without my steering wheel talking to me like it did the night before. Sent Sonia to relieve the babysitter. Did you see my children hanging out between the clouds during Standing on the Moon? Love you, bro. Whew. Yeah, that's real. There is zero hyperbole, zero poetic license on my part. This is a text message that was actually sent by a human being, and I still have a screenshot of it saved to my phone almost 9 years later. Whenever I'm in a bad mood or feeling depressed, I just go to this text message for a good laugh. It really encompasses almost everything about the followers of the dead that I find to be utterly hilarious. The second example is another anecdote from my time in Durango. Heather had traveled to the Chicago shows with a cohort of her Colorado hippie friends, and when they returned, we all met out at a downtown Durango dive bar called The Ranch, or El Rancho. Sitting at a quarter table while consuming numerous shots of expensive tequila, I listened to all of them tell tales from their experiences at the Chicago shows, but one comment really stood out. One of the hippie friends, had the following to say about the third night. I'm going to use my hippie voice. 70,000 people, man, and we were all one, joined together, all seeing and hearing the exact same thing, bruh, feeling the exact same thing. All of the energy created a unified consciousness. Now that's America, man. My hippie accent's amazing, I know. But anyway, I kept my mouth shut for the most part, me clearly being the outlier to this experience. Yet I do remember thinking one thing after this comment, and I really wanted to voice my opinion, though I knew that the square academic would be ignored. On a side note, there's really nothing square about me. But however, from the perspective of this collective group, yeah, the college professor who does not like the Grateful Dead is certainly a square. Alas, all I could think about was how I wanted to retort with, dude, that's not America at all. America is me being present there in the aisle with you at the same show and thinking to myself, after 50 years, I'm still not sure these dudes really know how to properly tune their guitars. Now that's America. Dissent and disagreement. I wanted to say that so bad. Of course, I could be hyperbolizing the untuned instruments. It could just be me. That's what I sometimes hear when I listen to them. Sorry, Bill Walton, R.I.P. Indeed, that's the point. I know people out there that utterly abhor Pearl Jam, and that's fine. People should like what they like. Yet, as I pointed out in our discussion of Pearl Jam, people should not necessarily shy away from that, which is different. And I did not shy away from the Grateful Dead that summer. Anyway, that evening, I did just keep my mouth shut and let the hippies talk. Now, let me make one thing abundantly clear. I went to college. Hence, I participated in most things that go into the college experience, including a little bit of excess. Again, I'm into the second half of my life right now, and I have tenure, so I really don't think that I'm going to get in any trouble divulging this reality, though I'll skip the specifics. Seriously, if universities would reprimand their professors for their past or present moments of experimentation or excess, there would be few of us left. However, what I learned from my forays into moments of excess, I think, is actually best encapsulated by the king of excess himself. And I'm talking about the good Dr. Hunter S. Thompson. Now, Hunter took part in the counterculture movements of the late 60s and early 70s. And if you know anything about the good doctor, well, nobody indulged as much as Hunter. Through his writings exist a plethora of moments dedicated to excess, that at times seems to echo or integrate themselves into the excesses of hippie culture as seen through Grateful Dead culture. Though the lines between hyperbole and reality are often blurred with the good doctor. Through his writings, one thing becomes abundantly clear. He finds the so-called heightened consciousness of drug use coupled with hippie culture to be pretty much absurd. For Hunter, getting fucked up was simply that. It didn't offer a religious experience or some kind of deeper understanding of life. Hunter's moments of excess, typically were for nothing more than shits and giggles. And there's really nothing wrong with that. I tend to agree with the good doctor. Those Dionysian moments, provide good stories and are sometimes a hell of a lot of fun, but have very little to do with God, energy, or a deeper understanding of the universe. On a side note, there have been lots of recent studies displaying the utility of certain drugs, such as psilocybin and MDMA, for psychological treatments of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. I won't rule that stuff out. But Hunter's hyperbole, in accord to alcohol and drugs, is hyperbole for a reason. He is parroting hippie culture and the Timothy Leary experiment. He posited the important cultural advantages of this drug in accord to our ability as a culture to tap into a form of heightened consciousness, whatever that may mean. At the same time, I guess, my deadhead friends typically say to me, dude, you've never experienced a show, so you can't understand. And this is true, and I admit this whole in my criticism. Yes, I streamed those shows in 2015, typically while sitting on the couch with my dog, sipping on a glass of red wine, which is clearly not the same thing as being present at a live concert, tripping on LSD without having showered for 48 hours. I'm so passive aggressive. Alas, with the death of Jerry Garcia in 1995, there's no chance for me to ever truly gain access to the authentic reality of the Grateful Dead. And I know what I'm talking. I know what I'm. I know what I'm about to say is going to piss off a lot of people. Maybe more so than what I've already said, but I'm going to say it anyway. Now, don't for 1 second tell me I can go see the newest iteration of this band, Dead & Co. Never going to happen. As good a guitarist as he may be, and he's pretty good, I will never pay any amount of money to see the guy who wrote the words to Your Body is a Wonderland. Listen, he's a badass guitarist, but no. Some of the stuff that he's written lyrically, just not going to happen. Sorry. So in the end, I'm left with albums, recordings, and YouTube clips. Still, what I'm also left with, fittingly enough, for my project are the lyrics. Now, to reiterate, my aversion to the Grateful Dead was and is rooted in the culture surrounding them, and I can readily admit this bias. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of their music, but over the years, I've grown cognizant that for a long time I've turned away from their music, mainly due to ethos and fandom. However, I have become a little more open in recent years to actually giving their music a chance. And surprise, surprise, some of it I actually like. Ripple is a mainstay in my class on poetry and music lyrics. This class that you're taking, kinda. Though for the present project, we're going somewhere else, somewhere beyond Ripple. My hippie buddies actually make fun of me because I happen to really like the folksy, bluesy "Me and My Uncle," which very few of them consider to be a canonical Dead jam. I think it might even be a cover. I'm not sure, but I really like that song. The studio recording of "Morning Dew" is average at best, but some of the live renditions are beautiful. And in the right environment, I can totally dig on a good version of the epic Terrapin Station. And I love Jerry's cover of Dear Prudence. Now, there were a couple of important developments that lent themselves to my ability to finally appreciate certain Dead songs. Both of these developments being obvious and fairly pretentious. The first being the clear literary influence that was one of the harbingers for the genesis of the band in the first place, the Beat Generation. Yeah, Neil Cassidy, the muse of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. He lived with Bob Weir in San Francisco. And along with City Lights Bookstore, run by beat writer Lawrence Ferlinghetti, being the mecca of the counterculture of the late 60s, the Beats had a tremendous influence on the early days of the Dead. There's a song entitled Cassidy, spelling's different. Neil Cassidy being, one of the kingpins of Ken Casey's Merry Pranksters, known for driving the LSD-fueled school bus that roamed throughout the country as the group participated in various misadventures, as documented by Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test from 1968. Now, the Beats also had a tremendous influence on Bob Dylan in the 1960s, primarily through Dylan's relationship with Allen Ginsberg. Though the narrative these artists spun in accord to rejecting the stringent culture of America in the 1950s and their ability to illuminate aspects of America that was typically ignored were all serious catalysts to Dylan's own political consciousness at the time. Alas, with this literary understanding, I came to think about the Grateful Dead in a way never previously considered. At the same time, once I started to pay more attention to their music and lyrics, this was mostly during the summer of 2015, when I was alone in a fairly sprawling Durango house in the mountains, I began to do a little due diligence. Now, I had spent enough time around Deadheads throughout my life to grasp that a lot of their lyrics were co-written by someone not necessarily in the band itself, Jerry Garcia's collaborator and friend, Robert Hunter. Subsequently, it was during one of those lonely evenings by myself with only my dog in a huge backyard that would have gotten me thrown in jail a few years prior, that while streaming one of those live concerts, I heard a song I had never heard before. And this particular song led me to doing a little research on Robert Hunter. It was not the fact that Hunter participated in LSD and other hallucinogenic experiments in the 60s, sponsored by the CIA, that drew my attention. However, it was his literary background, his early taste for literature, his proclivity for writing poetry, his poetic influences from Edmund Spenser to the British Romantics to modernism to Roca. All of this seemed, incongruous to my previously incorrect depiction of the Grateful Dead. Alas, as I've reiterated a few times, even with Robert Hunter's literary background, what I'm doing here is not aimed at locating literary allusion or influence. Still, I was quite taken aback by this realization, which ignited a desire to delve more deeply into the lyrics of the Dead, particularly their song Standing on the Moon, which was my favorite lyric that I witnessed while streaming the shows in the summer of 2015. Now, before we get into lyrics of the song itself, I ask you to bear with me for another minor digression. Back to Robert Hunter and the drug experiments. Well, maybe the entire drug culture surrounding the band. The drug connection vis-a-vis art, it's not an outlier for our culture. Our culture happens to love it. Excess and Dionysian revelry, being attached to artistic output. I mean, for fuck's sake, there are posters and T-shirts out there celebrating the 27 Club. All of those artists who died at 27 years old owing to excess or addiction or some, addiction of some kind. Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, etc., etc. And our culture holds this group up as a kind of collective victors for dying young. Now, none of this made sense to me, but I think at the heart of it, at least for our culture, is the notion that drug and alcohol abuse is what is actually needed for artistic output. And we privilege this cultural construction. Now, in thinking back to Robert Hunter, yeah, it's easy to go to his experiments with LSD. But like the 27 Club as a whole, what is often ignored is one very important reality: hard work. I know. Work is not as sexy as drugs. It's easy to focus on the Dionysian element. However, what must be remembered is that it's not all about the drugs. In his Birth of Tragedy, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche posits that tragedy, the highest of all art forms for Nietzsche, which is echoed by lyric poetry, can best be understood through the balance of Dionysus and Apollo. Now, Nietzsche complicates this comparison in a fairly dense manner, but to make it a little more accessible, yeah, Dionysus, we've discussed this dude, the god of wine, intoxication, revelry, dreams, fertility, sex. Now, that shit's appealing. Apollo, on the other hand, is the god of the sun, knowledge, reason. Boring. However, interestingly enough, both are, at times, considered to be the god of poetry. Now, that makes sense, especially if we go back a couple chapters to the romantic definition of chapters. There's that word again. Couple talks to the romantic definition of poetry, mainly from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in which poetry is a balance of discordant qualities. The problem is that our culture privileges the former and oftentimes alienates the latter, especially from a pop culture perspective. Funny, our culture actually privileges one side of a binary while alienating the other. There's lots of sarcasm here. The thing about Robert Hunter is that, yes, he took drugs, but he also read a shit ton, and he wrote a shit ton. You want to know what else he probably did? He edited. He researched, he revised. Boring stuff, but integral to artists. We've all heard about the 10,000 hour theory, from Malcolm Gladwell. But we want to talk about Jimi Hendrix taking LSD before performing the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock. Why? Because that shit's sexy. What do we not want to talk about? All of the practice that Jimmy put into honing his craft. That while in the military, every free minute he had, when he was in the military, he was playing his guitar. The time that he spent on what is known as the Chitlin circuit, playing backup and rhythm guitar. The Chitlin circuit, was a series of locales, mostly in the South, that made artistic performance accessible to black artists in the 1960s during segregation. Other things, the hours and hours of practice that Jimmy put into it. People, art is hard. Art is about work, diligent work. Now, to qualify this, I am not completely discounting the Dionysian side of this by any means. Listen, beyond my college experimentalism, I'm lucky enough to have gone through a couple fairly invasive surgeries. And during some pretty painful recoveries, I was on opiates to help alleviate the pain. Yes, they're addictive AF. But the reality is simple. You have some pretty, crazed lucid dreams while on those drugs, and you see some shit. During one of my recoveries, I clearly recall a dream in which I was in a hotel room jamming on an acoustic guitar with Slash from Guns N' Roses. I'm a fairly mediocre guitar player, by the way, but, both of us, Slash and I were smoking butts. I quit smoking 20 years ago, but, we're smoking butts, we're sipping Jack Daniels, just the two of us kicking so much ass. It was kind of similar to the video for Patience, but without the rest of the band. It was just me and Slash. Yeah, and it was awesome. Yet, with all of the drugs I was on, I never had a religious experience, didn't tap into the universe, nor did I somehow transform myself into an artist. The same was true during my college days. Taking that shit was cool for a little while, but I spent a hell of a lot more time just mindlessly staring at my television than thinking deeply. Similar to while I was in college, and after numerous bong hits, I just wanted to watch Beavis and Butthead while eating Ben and Jerry's. Should I have said that? I'm not taking it back. I'm saying it. Anyway, yes, you don't take drugs to become an artist, and that's the problem with our culture. You work, you practice, and then you work some more. The Dionysian side, well, yeah, it certainly helps in terms of perception. It's probably more useful to think about Dionysus metaphorically. The willingness to alter our perceptions, along with the openness to seeing the world anew, to being open. We can perceive things differently, interpret the world differently, but drugs are not the sole driving force behind altering our perception. And in terms of art, my problem is that the diligent work is often what is forgotten. We love Dionysus. Apollo is boring. Um, hmm. At the same time, I'm not going to get into this too much, but if you read Nietzsche's, Birth of Tragedy, you'll come to see how Dionysus is also representative of music, and Apollo, quite possibly, words, which in and of itself might be the foundation for everything that I've been doing. But anyway, we don't need to take Dionysus so literally. Now, where were we? Oh, yeah. Standing on the Moon by the Grateful Dead. Now, we're going to go about this in a slightly different manner than my previous discussions, mainly beginning with the lyric first, before going to the poetry to help elucidate some potential meaning or meanings. So, co written by Garcia and Hunter, this complex lyric utilizes a brilliant dynamic of movement and, oh boy, I'm getting redundant or repetitive, poetic reversal. At first glance, the lyric actually does not seem to be too complex at all. We have a speaker distanced from the earth, witnessing all of the chaos of reality. A little patriotism thrown in as the American flag planted on the moon flows alongside, and then a possible transition into some kind of love song as the distant speaker, desires to be back on earth with this unnamed, repetitive you. I'd rather be with you. Simple enough, right? Well, as you've seen thus far, I have a penchant for turning the seemingly simplistic into something a tad more intricate, and I'm going to do that now. So let's begin with our speaker, who is, well, standing on the moon. If you want to, you can take time right now, look up the lyrics, listen to the song, blah, 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 blah. We've already talked about this. Press pause, come back. Here we are. And here is our speaker standing on the moon. Standing on the moon, I got no cobweb on my shoe. Standing on the moon, I'm feeling alone and blue. The significance of distance becomes the first striking element to this lyric as it offers up a sense of melancholy, signified through the mundane, earthly realities that do not exist on the moon. A simple cobweb on my shoe, something that in everyday life we typically take little note of. However, via distance, our speaker is quite cognizant of missing out on something earthly and simple. Yet, as simple as a mere cobweb on the shoe may be, its absence is noticed mainly due to distance. We tend not to miss the ordinary until the ordinary is no longer present. As the narrative of the lyric progresses, we witness the realities down on earth that our speaker is distanced from. At first, potential beauty through the vistas of the Gulf of Mexico and the coast of California, both eliciting an aesthetic image of land and sea conjoined. Yet there's a sense of movement in the lyric between where the subject is and what the subject is perceiving, and almost back and forth through each verse stanza, as there's a tension between the one standing on the moon and what the distant subject is perceiving, with the repetition of the phrase, I see, over and over again. The lyric is almost like a swinging pendulum, a pendulum that takes us to the realities of life on Earth and then back to the distant safety of the celestial world. Now, the movement away from the potential beauty of the natural world, along with the horrors that coexist on Earth, is difficult to locate if we're just passively listening to the song. As Jerry's vocal delivery does not deviate, we hear the battle rage below, along with I see the soldiers come and go, in almost the exact same cadence as the Gulf of Mexico. So distinguishing the subject matter is not easy if we do not pay attention to the words, which phonetically signify a marriage of positivity and negativity that is almost indistinguishable. The incongruity becomes magnified through the following lines. I hear the cries of children and the others' songs of war. It's like a mighty melody that rings down from the sky. Now, coupling the horrors of war with the melody from the sky symbolizes a dissonance that luckily our speaker is distanced by and can only perceive from afar. There was that sense of melancholy in the opening lines aimed at being distanced from the realities of life on Earth before we get to this striking image of terror. Now, this was a song that came out in 1989, well after the Vietnam War. But the Grateful Dead experienced the realities of the 60s and 70s, and those images tend to dwell. Even today, have the realities of those horrors actually gone anywhere? These words may also signify the ubiquity of war and loss that seems to be a constant within our culture. In a nutshell, what our speaker gets to witness from afar is the reality of life on Earth, both the majesty and the tragedy. Nevertheless, one of the most striking instances within the lyric is the image of the American flag. There's a metal flag beside me, someone planted long ago. Okay, conspiracy theorists, you can skip this part because, yes, the American flag was actually planted on the moon on July 20th, 1969, by astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. It was not a staged Hollywood production. And what I consider to be the most poignant moment of the entire lyric is how Robert Hunter and Jerry Garcia put a little twist on the good old red, white, and blue, tweaking the image of Old Glory to crimson, white, and indigo. Kind of an ironic gesture that is by no means a simple hippie attempt at creating something beautiful. No, that would be too easy. So why tweak the colors of the flag? In thinking about what is actually occurring in the world, in the real world, via this distanced perception, the subject on the moon is bearing witness and has clear knowledge of reality and all of its wonder and all of its horror. With the flag beside our perceiver, the instinct may be to think about the flag as a sign of patriotism. And that's not a bad read. However, patriotism is a loaded term, both today and some 30 years ago, especially in the context of the brutality of war. No more hiccups. Crimson, white, and indigo seemingly romanticizes the American flag by prettying it up, so to speak, or possibly cleaning up the very notion of patriotism. Yet what must be remembered is that the horrors being witnessed, at least a decent amount of them, were actually instigated by the red, white, and blue, as is still the case today. Yes, patriots, we are culpable. Nevertheless, crimson, white, and indigo undermines the illusion of the actual flag, signifying the flaws of the real colors, and in effect problematizing the very notion of patriotism. Remember what I said earlier about dissent and disagreement? Yeah, by changing the colors, that is exactly what Hunter and Garcia accomplished. A statement of dissent towards the colors that never run, which in reality oftentimes run blood red, all in the name of the good old US of A. Yes, the horror is actually about us. Crimson, white, and indigo is a more palatable reality, one that does not hide behind ideology. Maybe it's what we should be. For true patriotism is not accepting the world as it is, but attempting to better our own cultural inadequacies. Oof, almost a spoiler, but I'm going to come back to that concept. But with the distance comes perspective, and this distance seems to signify an almost desire to escape from the realities down below. However, remember, this lyric begins with a sense of melancholy towards being distanced from reality. Alas, this is the significant tension within the lyric, and where reversal really comes into play. The tension occurs between existing on the moon, being distanced from reality, versus existing on Earth, where reality may include beauty, but also the horrors of war. The moon seemingly signifies a form of escapism, as the vision is true. But we actually know from the very beginning what choice our speaker is going to make. Even existing among the celestial grandeur, reality is what matters in all of its magnificence and dread. But I'd rather be with you. This indefinite pronoun you could signify a particular love interest. But I actually think it's more fitting to see the you as nothing more than reality of life on Earth itself. With all of the shit that exists down there, our speaker would rather take reality over anything else, even escaping the negativity of reality by standing on the moon. The reversal comes late in the last two stanzas or verses. For up until then, it is pure perception of what is going on down there, and distance seems to offer a kind of buffer. Yet this changes quickly, kind of like a good sonnet, where there's a little shift that flips the first half on its head. With all of the negativity, I'd rather be with you. This reversal is pure affirmation of life and everything that comes with life. The lyric is a plea for the panoramic of life, a joie de vivre in the face of even the most terrible. And that is true joie de vivre, which once again takes us back to the British Romantic poets. Or maybe the British Romantic poets take us to the Grateful Dead. At this point, I don't know or care, but for me, this analysis just makes too much sense. There's a bad stereotype concerning the British Romantics that suggests that most or many of these thinkers and their culture offer a kind of nostalgic yearning for a pre-lapsarian world, a world before the fall, that innocence and youth, trumps maturity and knowledge. That we must kind of return to the garden, kind of like, hanging out in the moon. Yet this is a facile and erroneous depiction of Romanticism. To begin, one of the most overlooked and significant contributors to Romantic thought is poet Charlotte Smith. Smith was one of the most famous writers of the late 18th century and early 19th century, becoming an integral influence on canonical Romantic poet William Wordsworth, who commented that unfortunately Smith would be lost to history, as was the case with many women partaking in a profession dominated by men. Yet Smith was key in transitioning away from Enlightenment era values, mainly by repopularizing the sonnet, a poetic form that had grown out of favor during the Enlightenment, maybe most likely due to its short, almost fragmented lyrical structure, which was an affront to the more heightened, formulaic verse of the previous century. Her collection, entitled Elegiac Sonnets, went through 10 different versions between 1784 and 1810, expanding upon each edition. And it was arguably the most important early piece of Romantic poetry, prior to Wordsworth and Coleridge's collaboration of lyrical ballads published in 1798. Her poems were singularly emotive and oftentimes bleak, which makes sense for someone who lived a difficult life, dealing with an abusive husband, losing 3 of her 12 children during childbirth, 12, jeez, working in a profession in which she was clearly marginalized owing to her sex. But in getting back to the Romantic questions of nostalgia or a desire for life before the fall, I'm speaking metaphorically, Smith can be seen as a harbinger of this type of discourse that becomes so integral to Romantic culture. Her sonnet entitled On Being Cautioned Against Walking Along a Headland Overlooking the Sea Because It Was Frequented by a Lunatic. Whew, best title ever. is a prime example of this important dynamic. Go ahead and look it up. It's easy. Just put Charlotte Smith lunatic sonnet. It'll come up. I'm not going anywhere. Read it. It's 14 lines. Now to summarize, the first 8 lines are pretty straightforward. As our poet speaker questions whether there is some disturbed person walking around this landscape, murmuring to the surf. Simple enough. But remember, what I wrote a few paragraphs ago, or what I talked about, a few paragraphs ago about, reversal and standing on the moon, and comparing it to a good sonnet. Well, that's what sonnets typically do in one way or another. They present a general theme, usually in the octave, the first 8 lines, before completely reversing the theme, or at least filtering it down through a more specific lens, which is occasionally accomplished in the sestet, the final 6 lines. And that's what Smith's first-person speaker does so well in this lyric. For after the general intimations of the first 8 lines, all of a sudden our poet speaker, quote, sees him, the lunatic, more with envy than with fear. Wow. Why envy a mentally deranged individual walking around talking to himself and the sea? The answer is simple. He is, as we see in line 13, uncursed with reason. Wow again. Yeah, that's quite a thing to say coming out of the Enlightenment, that reason or knowledge is some kind of curse. But think about it. Knowledge of the world is difficult. Reality is not easy, and there is almost always baggage. You need a couple examples. Fine. All right, I'll give you a couple of examples. Let me think. Knowledge is difficult. Anyone familiar with Frederick Douglass's narrative of an American slave? You should recall that chilling moment when Douglass first learns how to read. He actually envies his illiterate fellow slaves, for they do not have the knowledge of reality that he has attained. They are unaware of the realities of their predicament, and he envies them. Shite. Indeed, sometimes it seems that it is easier not to know, to remain in a state of blissful ignorance. There's so many examples. I just, one more brief. President Nixon, pulled the cameras out of Vietnam because he did not want American families coming home at the end of the day, all right, seeing, having the knowledge, all right, of dead American soldiers right in front of them. Knowledge is hard. Sometimes, like I said, it's easier not to know. To remain in a state of blissful ignorance, as I said before. And that's the tension that Smith constructs in her poem, a tension that goes on to haunt Romantic culture for the next 3 decades in various iterations. Would we rather be in a pure state of bliss without the realities of the world, or accept what comes with time, understanding of the world around us in all of its majesty and dread? Sound familiar? Should. Now, let's ground this historically for the Romantics. All right, at least the early Romantics. The best example of this tension, really can be found in the French Revolution. 1789 was a time kind of pure exuberance for many thinkers. Bliss at where we in the West had arrived in understanding that nations should be republics, run by the people and for the people. Yeah, liberté, égalité, fraternité. It was a moment in time of overwhelming emotion and excitement, almost childlike. Obviously, aristocrats and people with titles weren't quite as enthused. And then within a couple of years, by 1792, we have the Reign of Terror, the guillotine, daily beheadings, blood literally flowing through the streets of Paris. And who was culpable? Many of those same Jacobins who created that overwhelming sense of joy a few years prior. All of a sudden, that bliss had turned into horror. Mainly owing to the knowledge of what we as human beings are capable of. Yes, we're capable of great humanistic endeavors, while at the same time we're capable of terrible cruelties. That's the curse of knowledge. And I understand Smith's poet being tempted by blissful ignorance. As I said, this dynamic between blissful ignorance and the negativity that comes with knowledge, it becomes a pervasive trope throughout romantic culture. There's Blake's songs of innocence and experience. Wordsworth creates this tension between the purity of youth and the quote still sad music of humanity in lots of his works, most notably Tintern Abbey and his ode Intimations on Immortality. We touched on this tangentially with Lord Byron a little while back. The motif runs rampant throughout Frankenstein. I already mentioned Keats' notion of negative capability. That's just to name a few. However, to reiterate, the misnomer is that Romanticism is actually about rejecting the negativity of knowledge in favor of the purity of youth and blissful ignorance. Yet this is not the case. Romanticism is a recognition of both sides of this binary, that we begin life in a state of bliss, but the inevitable maturity will arrive, along with the difficult knowledge of the world and what human beings are capable of. Alas, the question for many romantics becomes, how are we to deal with this incongruity? Listen, I talk way too much about Wordsworth in my next talk, so I'm going to go to John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, a poem that constructs this dynamic from the very beginning. As a whole, go ahead and look it up if you need to. If you've never read it, Keats's Ode to a Nightingale is always worth reading and rereading. But press pause, come back. So as a whole, the poem seems to be about, some depressed dude falling asleep while listening to this happy bird singing its song. As the poet speaker proclaims in the very first line, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense. Yet the bird arrives, singing of summer in full-throated ease. Excuse me. And as the poet speaker, grows drowsy, listening to the song, he acknowledges the bird's lack of understanding of the world and reality. Where men sit and hear each other groan, watch the fucking news, people. Where youth grows pale and specter thin and dies. Jeez, do we really need to get into the premature loss of life in the world in which we live today? Where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes. Just the reality. We lose our looks unless we're, Jennifer Aniston or George Clooney. Nevertheless, the bird exists as a medium of escape, and the speaker, who falls further into a dreamlike state as the poem progresses, appears to join the bird, almost flying away from the negativity on Earth. Yet remember, this is the negative capability dude. As the speaker appears to be departing from the realities of Earth, almost like heading to the moon, he recognizes that which he can no longer see. The grass, the thicket, the fruit tree wild, the coming muskrose, full of dewy wine, white hawthorn and pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets. This is what the speaker will miss out on if he escapes. Similar to Jerry on the moon, thinking about San Francisco on a back porch in July. Nevertheless, as the temptation to escape hits its ultimate moment with now more than ever seems it rich to die, death being the ultimate escape, this poem, like a good sonnet, has its quick reversal. Thou was not born for death, immortal bird. I understand that, some readers' critics may very well disagree with my reading here, and that's fine. Remember, this is poetry. Nevertheless, at this point in the poem, the speaker seemingly has conjoined with the bird. So in a sense, the poet is suggesting that the poet, and maybe more specifically, poetry is not about escape. Indeed, our speaker wakes in the final stanza and acknowledges the fading vision, acknowledges, the deceptive element of escapism. It's typically at this point in class, when I show my students, the brilliant film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which, like season 1 of True Detective, if you've never seen, there's a tremendous hole in your existence. But indeed, poetry, or maybe art in general, is not about, taking us someplace else, but magnifying the reality of life on earth. Um, yeah. Uh, Magnifying life on earth. What's that mean? Magnifying life in all of its glory, in all of its dread. Not hiding. Now, that is negative capability. Alas, from both the Grateful Dead lyric and Romanticism, there's a recognition of the temptation to get away. There was some sort of animal flying from by me. To get away from the brutal realities that come with knowledge of the world around us. However, in the end, they'd rather be with you. Indeed, that is what art is all about, displaying and pining for life as it is, affirming life even through the bleakness and devastation that is inevitable. Now, this is seemingly an echo from our chapter on Byron and Kurt Cobain, but with a little bit of a twist. We got to learn a lot about ourselves as readers and critics in that chapter. Putting the Dead together with Romanticism results in a different quote unquote lesson. For we can extrapolate something quite significant from this reading. Actually, I think this might be the most integral cultural moment from any of our discussions thus far, and maybe my entire project as a whole. As both the lyrics from the poem and the poems and the song suggest the importance of confronting life as it is. Now, I'm not going to get too anecdotal here. However, one thing I always hate is seeing someone on a dating app who says, please no drama, or I don't do drama. Ugh, I can't believe I just admitted to using dating apps. Such is life. All right, so be it. Now, these people who don't do drama are pure escapists, because the reality of life is that there's always going to be drama of some kind. You can't avoid negativity. Every day is not going to be sunshiny, bright, and full of unicorns and Care Bears. Shit happens, and there's no way to avoid it. The well-adjusted, mature adults of the world understand this reality, and they're ready to confront obstacles, not run from them. Have you heard about ghosting? Seriously, ghosting is the ultimate form of escapism, coupled with an utter inability to confront reality. People who cannot communicate or refuse to communicate, they're the emotionally stunted, and they have no clue the damage this type of behavior does to actual individuals who are well adjusted and wish to communicate and confront conflict. But as we've learned, knowledge reality is difficult. I understand why people run and hide. I understand that cowardice is easier than dealing with the world as it is. No one actually likes drama. However, there are those out there that know and understand that drama is part of life. Those people I would call poetic. Typically, it's the escapists who don't want to deal with negativity. Those are the ones that create drama in the first place. There's no poetry in their lives. Now, I said I wasn't going to get into Wordsworth, but just briefly, the dude is really into memories, or what he calls spots of time. Yes, those moments in our lives when sensory objects, smells, tastes, objects, trigger a lost moment from the past. Those of you that have seen Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind know why I'm, referenced it. Sometimes these can be pleasant memories. Sometimes these can be painful memories. Point being, for Wordsworth, they are all significant and meant to be analyzed, meant to be recognized. Now, I may be playing amateur therapist at this point, but Wordsworth's notion of spots of time reiterates the importance of the decision that was made in Standing on the Moon by the Grateful Dead. We need to both acknowledge and examine not just the world, but ourselves, even the shit that's not easy to look at. Think about it. If we wish to grow and better ourselves as individuals, we must be willing to confront the difficult stuff, not escape from it. To gain knowledge of who we are means looking at our own inadequacies and recognizing mistakes so we don't make them again. Yes, people, this is about self-examination. And in essence, through Wordsworth, we come to understand that, well, we all need to go to therapy. I love my therapist, all right? If you've seen, the brilliant Paul Thomas Anderson movie Magnolia from 1999, you remember the line that is repeated throughout. You may be through with the past, but the past is not through with you. Like I said, I may be playing amateur shrink right now, but by repressing the hard stuff, by ignoring the things that are difficult to look at, we stunt our ability to grow as individuals. And it is this that oftentimes leads to self invoked trauma. Alas, there's a fine line between examining the past in a healthy manner and dwelling too much on the past, which can also stunt growth, I think. And that's for you to figure out as individuals. But we cannot ignore negativity. We cannot pretend that it does not exist. For Wordsworth, we go backwards as a means to go forwards, but we can never simply deracinate the past completely. All right. Wordsworth's buddy Coleridge actually echoes this sentiment when he writes in his Biographia Literaria from 1815, when he's describing the form of a poem as a serpent that moves in a nonlinear fashion, like life. It's not straightforward. Now, I've been dealing with this on the micro level, but we can also translate it to the macro level. Think about it from from a cultural perspective. If we as Americans, or any culture for that matter, wish to progress, the only way we can do this is by looking at our mistakes, recognizing our own guilt and inadequacies as a collective whole, and fixing those mistakes as opposed to ignoring them or blaming someone else. Yes, this includes our history. And again, this is not easy. Uh, Going back to the beginning of this chapter, living down south as I do, you're probably getting the gist of what I'm talking about. One thing that I find to be quite repugnant down here is so-called plantation culture. The establishments that house the most brutal horrors of slavery. Some of them are now fucking tourist attractions, and I don't mean in the same vein as visiting Auschwitz or Dachau. No. These places, most of them, or a lot of them, have been restored, cleaned up, and guess what? You and your significant other can go spend a romantic weekend at one of these plantations. The landscape is gorgeous. The smell of magnolia in the air, the green of the trees and grass, and maybe a beautiful sunflower garden or some azaleas. At the same time, you can eat dinner in one of the nice restaurants that have been put on the first floor of the plantation. If you want, you can probably even dress up in your antebellum best. People have weddings at these places, engagements, debutante coming out parties. Uh, Talk about not facing fucking reality. It's actually sickening. Getting back to Germany, well, they at least confronted their own personal horrors and owned it. You won't drive down the Autobahn seeing a pickup truck with a swastika bumper sticker on it, mainly because the swastika has been outlawed in Germany. The Heil Hitler salute is also illegal. Listen, I'm not suggesting that Germany doesn't have its fair share of problems and far right nationalist movements, as a lot of European countries have, as well as America. But as a whole, Germany has at least confronted or attempted to confront their past flaws. Yes, this is called recognizing guilt and accepting it, not pretending it never happened. You don't go to Auschwitz for a christening or a confirmation party. You go there to witness the past, the horrors that occurred, and to learn from the mistakes of the past. It's not easy, but as we already learned, knowledge is not supposed to be easy. Yet what we find in Germany is what the American South should do. Own your past. These plantations should be historical monuments that we can visit to understand the mistakes that were made. We should be able to confront our guilt, grieve, and cry, not hide behind a crawfish boil on the steps of a plantation that witnessed torture, murder, and the dehumanization of an entire race. There should be plaques up there with the names of the plantation owners and all of the horrific things they took part in. There should be memorials to all the Africans who lost their lives in those places. Instead, we have etouffee and Easter egg hunts on the sprawling lawns that cover up a century of spilt blood. That is what I'd call an emotionally stunted culture. I think I said this in a previous chapter or a previous discussion. When we fuck up or are all fucked up, as individuals or a culture, then we must be willing to unfuck ourselves. That's how we progress. Jeez. All of this from a simple music lyric and a little bit of poetry. Man, I just got a little deep. You probably thought at the beginning of this chapter this was all going to be about drugs and hippie stuff. I guess I tricked you. But in getting back to those hippies in Durango, suggesting that art unites us, well, it's simply enough not true. Math, science, that unites us, or at least it should. Art very well may create some kind of a heightened consciousness, but it's not through unity. The agency of art exists through our ability to disagree. And through this disagreement, we learn, just as we learned from the Grateful Dead and a little romantic poetry. So, what exactly have we learned? Simply enough that we must recognize our burden, but continue to push the rock up the hill. Oh, yeah, I just referenced Albert Camus. And as Camus taught us, we will always find our burden, but that should not dissuade us from continuing to strive, nor should it entice us to escape. We continue to push the rock, even with the burden of negativity, mainly because we know that there will always be those days when we're chilling on a back porch in July with Jerry and his hippies, or have the ability to take in the perfume of a dewy musk rose, as John Keats wrote. Listen, to slightly pivot, looking at art is similar to looking at a good therapy session. For example, you watch a movie with a buddy, and then afterwards, the two of you, you grab a cup of coffee or a beer, and you discuss the movie. You offer your thoughts, and then your buddy says something completely different. And guess what? You may understand the movie in a completely different manner through your buddy's take on it, whether you agree or disagree. It's the same thing with a good therapy session. You offer your therapist a narrative of a life experience and how you understand it. And then the therapist offers you something completely different. And guess what happens? You learn something a little bit about yourself, whether you like what you hear or not. In so many words, you, all of us, can become a work of art. Wow. Again, all of this from a simple music lyric and a little bit of poetry. Cool stuff. I like it. Let's move on. Let's talk about something else. Cool. Have a good day, peeps. Keep rocking in the free world.